And welcome back. We now are going to proceed to what should be a really interesting panel. A couple of years ago, a decision, Janus v. AFSCME, restored rights to public sector employees throughout Pennsylvania not to be required to be forced to join or pay dues to a labor union as a condition of employment. However, as you might imagine, labor unions aren't exactly often following the law, and we're going to talk about that today. Our panel will be moderated by Nathan McGrath. And Nathan is the Vice President and Director of Litigation at the Fairness Center. And there he litigates legal strategy to advance the interests of working Pennsylvanians. Prior to going to the Fairness Center, Nathan was a staff attorney with the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, Incorporated. And here with our next panel entitled, Shut Up and Dance With Me, How Unions Keep Public Employees from Ending Their Memberships, Nathan McGrath.
Thank you so much. We're excited to be here today, and we actually have three panelists with us that are going to take a different look, different perspective at the same issue. First with us today, we have Greg Hartnett, who's a Pennsylvania public school teacher, and he's actually going to give us a real-world experience about what it took to get out of his union. And then secondly, we have Elizabeth Kynes, and she's the National Executive Director of Americans for Fair Treatment, and she's going to give us a national look at what's going on as far as union resignation goes and other matters related to that. And then finally, we have State Representative David ROWE, and he's going to talk to us about what's going on in the labor reform area here in Pennsylvania and what legislation is current on this issue. But before we get to that, I just wanted to give you a lay of the land of, in Pennsylvania, what the current law is and what our public employees are up against if they want to leave, and what the legislators are looking to address. So, in Pennsylvania, the law authorizes a public sector union and the public employer to insert language into a collective bargaining agreement that restricts public employees from resigning their union membership. The technical name of this is maintenance of membership, and it literally means that the employee needs to remain in the union and they can't resign their union membership until a 15-day window period at the end of the collective bargaining agreement. Now, these collective bargaining agreements can be anywhere from 3 to 4 years. So as you can imagine, this can keep them locked in to union membership for quite a while. Now, the law still remains on the books to this day authorizing this, even though in the past couple years, many public employees have sued their unions and the Commonwealth and the governor and others to try to resign from the union and to claim their First Amendment constitutional rights. So with that groundwork laid, let's move to our first panelist, Greg Hartnett. He's an elementary art teacher at Homer Center Elementary School in Indiana County, Pennsylvania. He's been teaching there since 1999. He's a graduate of Indiana University of Pennsylvania and completed postgraduate coursework at Gannon University and also at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Recently, he was actually the lead plaintiff in a lawsuit, federal lawsuit, that my law firm filed on his behalf. He and his co-plaintiffs sought a ruling from the federal courts that Pennsylvania's compulsory union fee law be held unconstitutional in light of the U.S. Supreme Court's Janus v. AFSCME ruling. However, today he's not going to talk about that so much as he's going to tell you the real world, the real life example of how many years ago he made the decision to leave his union and what that consisted of. So with that, welcome, Greg. It's all yours.
Thank you, Nathan. My story probably begins in college. As an education major in college, I was coached by my professors to become a member of the union. It was imperative that they convince us that that was necessary for us. And so that was my backstory in that regard. After college, I worked about 21 years in the private sector. I worked in a nonprofit, and I worked as a substitute teacher. So my worldview was being shaped largely by the fact that I was a husband, a father of 5, and I had worked with people for a number of years and was accustomed to that kind of a work environment. When I was hired as a teacher in 1999, it became obvious to me early on that the union agenda was not the same as my own personal agenda. It did not fit my politics, my preferences, or my worldview. And that became a source of consternation, and it was difficult for me to sit through union meetings where the candidates that I approved of were treated with disdain. They were not recommended. They were not so-called pro-education candidates who were being backed by the union. I tried at one point, or I suggested that perhaps I resign from the union, and I was told that although it would be possible for me to do that, it would not be economically worthwhile because I still would have to pay fair share fees, which would be almost as much as the union dues I was accustomed to. And if I would leave the union, I would lose some of the protections that the union provided for me. It was about 12 years later that I decided that I could no longer stay within the parameters of the public sector union, the Pennsylvania State Education Association. And when our union president wore her Teachers for Obama t-shirt to our first union meeting that year, I decided that that was a bridge too far for me, and I'd had enough. I contacted the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation in Washington, D.C. They hooked me up with Nathan, and things got a lot easier from there as I came to recognize that I was not the sole person who was in such a position and had difficulty with the union. I attempted to resign from the union, but because of the maintenance of membership clause that Nathan referenced, I was given in short term the answer no, that I could not resign from the union because I had not prepared my resignation within that 15-day window at the end of the contract. Nathan assisted me in drafting a letter informing the union that they were violating my First Amendment rights of association and freedom of speech. And so that seemed to do the trick, and a short time later, I was released from the union element of the contract, although I was still required to pay the fair share fees. I did receive a retroactive check for the year 2012 to 2013, which was helpful, but it wasn't until the Supreme Court ruled on the Janus decision that I was actually able to leave the union altogether. I was finally free from the oppression of the public sector unions, and for that I'm extremely grateful. I have a profound respect for the Constitution, and I'm grateful for our heritage as Pennsylvanians and groups like the Fairness Center and the National Right to Work Legal Defense Group for helping me and people like me. That's my story. Greg. My pleasure.
No, that's a great story. And actually, before I had been asked to moderate this panel, you had already been put on it. And so when I was asked to do it, I looked at the lineup and I was like, oh, my good friend Greg. Greg was actually my very first client ever, really, on this issue. So we've had a nice long friendship that way, and it's glad to be able to help you in that.
Thank you, Nathan.
Yeah, so next up we have Elizabeth Kynes, and she, like I said earlier, is the National Executive Director for Americans for Fair Treatment. Upon earning her journalism degree from the University of South Carolina, Elizabeth put her degree to good use in the publicity department at Atlantic Records in Los Angeles, California. From there, she learned how to build organizations that would impact culture through positions in operations and business development at Universal Music Group, Vivo, and Beats Music. Prior to joining the staff at Americans for Fair Treatment, Elizabeth served as Executive Vice President at Yankee Institute for Public Policy. Thanks for being here with us, Elizabeth.
Thank you for having me. So as far as what I'm seeing at more of a national level, I guess one thing that's important to remember is that big labor is a big business. And like any big business, they need to secure streams of revenue. The three ways that we're seeing this across the country and here in Pennsylvania are through litigation, which you know well, legislation, which preview of what's to come, and then membership cards. I would say as far as this year, the trends that we're seeing with litigation, I think they could be summed up with a very legal term, meh. We're seeing a lot of dismissals. We're seeing a lot of just stalling, and then judges are mooting cases. So you had referenced the Janus case from the Supreme Court from 2018. I think it's important for people watching to understand the Supreme Court issues a decision, but they don't enforce the decision. These decisions are enforced, by people at the state level or local level or in the circuit courts. And so what we're seeing this year specifically, at the start of the year, there were 121 of these labor-related membership-type cases. So 13 of those were dismissed, and the remaining 108 are still active. They're all pending. They've not gotten decisions. So that's something that we see that's happening at the litigation level. As far as legislation, we're seeing state statute is enforcing these maintenance of membership windows, which is what you referred to. So this is something that's been around for a long time, and again, it makes sense. Membership is a revenue stream for the union, getting these the fees, pre-Janus, but then also the full dues. And so what we're seeing there in states like New Jersey, New York, and Hawaii, state statute is actually specifying that you can only opt out of the union or leave the union within maybe a 10 or 15-day window. And then that membership card, we're seeing some really colorful language since the Janus decision. Stuff like, this is a little extreme, but it feels a little bit like reading something. You can leave the union on a Saturday, 15 days after you sign this contract under a full moon. The language is very complicated, and in some instances, what we're seeing, specifically in New England, people are being asked to pay fees through retirement. So that's, for the rest of their life, as long as they collect a pension. So I think it's really interesting right now. I think you're very brave to step forward. I think there are a lot of people out there who are not happy with the service they're receiving from their unions, and it's really complicated right now, and it's difficult to leave, but there are organizations out there that can provide information and help wade through all of that.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. Next up, we have Representative David Rowe, and he served his local community in Snyder and Union counties in a number of roles for more than a decade while being involved with multiple charitable organizations. He attended National Sun Yat-sen University in Taiwan and participated in its Mandarin Chinese immersion study after 2 years of Christian missionary work as an educator in Southeast Asia. For the past 9 years, he has been the owner and operator of CrossFit Lewisburg, which employs several local residents. He attends the New Hope Lutheran Brethren Church in East Buffalo Township and is a leader of its music ministry. And on September 17th, 2019, he began representing Pennsylvania's 85th district in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives after a special election victory. The district includes most of Union and Snyder counties, including Lewisburg, Middlesburg, Mifflinburg, and Selinsgrove. Representative, thank you so much for being here with us. We look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here with you guys. So the recent push towards labor reform, at least within Harrisburg, is summarized around one underlying statement, and that belief system is that workers have rights too. And for decades now, special interest groups, both in state and federal governments, have really been enriching themselves off of the backs of their employees, of the workers, of the public sector workers. And they have used those monies to entrench themselves in state government, and then they're able to then use taxpayer resources to solidify their standing by using taxpayer resources to then collect their dues, to then continue the cycle of entrenching and enriching themselves off the backs of the American worker. There's a couple of legislative items that we're working towards, a number of House bills out there. I'm only speaking for the House side as a member of the House of Representatives. I'm sure a senator could speak to those bills a little bit more comfortably. But they center around some of the things that you guys have already mentioned. Some of those include the maintenance of membership clauses. Some of those include just notifications of employees' rights, because many of the statutes that we have here in Pennsylvania are simply outdated. Since the Janus ruling, we are simply trying to codify in statute the ruling of the Supreme Court, and just getting that done has been very difficult, even though we are simply putting into the books what has already been determined by the Supreme Court. So really, this should just be a housekeeping set of bills by this point, but it is still receiving an enormous amount of pushback from those people who really have been controlling the levers of state government for entirely too long. I'll give you a rundown on a couple of pieces of legislation, particularly one that's worth noting is Representative Seth Grove's bill, HB 478. And essentially that one requires union recertification about every 6 years, The reason that that's important is that in Pennsylvania, less than 1% of teachers have ever had a say in what union represents them. Less than 1%. These unions have simply been around for and ever, and they are represented, these teachers are represented by them because it's what they are supposed to do. It's what they believe they have to do in order to have a job, and that's just simply not true. So Representative Seth Grove's bill requires union recertification every 6 years. I also introduced a bill, House Bill 2748, that would require recertification every 3 years. So there's a couple of different approaches here, but most of them are, again, centralized around just notifying employees of their rights. Several of these bills also require allowing union members to leave their union whenever they would like, to allow them to resign their membership. As he mentioned earlier, it's almost impossible to leave your union because a lot of times the window where you're able to, under the existing statute, is so narrow that by the time you find out about it, it's already too late. And then you're stuck in there again. So there's a number of objectives there to allow people to just have that First Amendment right to choose whether or not to be a part of their union. And the important thing to realize is that this is not about eliminating unions. Rather, it's about improving the quality of representation. Because for as I mentioned, most of these unions haven't been recertified for decades. And we live in a society where, a capitalist society, as long as it lasts, where competition in the marketplace always improves the quality of the product while reducing the price. And that's been what has allowed America and Americans to enjoy a standard of living that was unheard of just a few decades ago. And so the same thing should be applied to representation. When these unions do not have any sort of competition in the public sector workplace, they are able to essentially create a monopoly where they are able to control the levers of power without ever having to justify themselves or to do well by the people who pay their bills. So there's several exciting pieces of legislation coming forward. A lot of them are committees. Some of them are working their way towards the House floor. But that's sort of a broad overview of where we are today.
Fantastic. And are there any pieces of legislation that have actually moved forward beyond just consideration?
Yeah, absolutely. So Representative Kate Klunk has a bill, House Bill 785, and that one has passed out of the Labor and Industry Committee, which I'm a part of, 2 terms in a row. It is currently on second consideration in the House, and the difficult push forward is somewhat unfathomable, given that, again, these are mostly just housekeeping bills. We are codifying what the Supreme Court has already ruled to be that these bills are just a protection of our First Amendment rights and the First Amendment rights of the workers in Pennsylvania. So again, these legislative objectives are centered in the belief system that workers have rights too.
Wonderful. Now, Greg, I would like to come back to you real quick, something that I heard from both of your co-panelists here about union members and in public employees just generally. Do they even know about their rights? What has been your experience with colleagues that you've had and worked with?
Well, in my experience, I would say that my colleagues are unaware that they have the right and the opportunity to leave the union or choose another entity for protections that historically the union provides. There's a group called KETA, who I've heard of, that works with Pennsylvania teachers to provide protections that, again, the unions historically provide, but they provide, as the free market insists, a better product for a less expensive cost. And I would say also that from talking with many of my peers, there is an increased dissatisfaction with the one product that the Pennsylvania State Education Association provides. And the COVID epidemic has kind of brought that to the fore. People have different opinions as to how that should be handled, but the union seems to have one solution which doesn't fit everybody. So I would say that there is a naivete about being able to leave the union. They do not have the opportunity to opt in or opt out on any kind of a regular basis, so they're beholden to what they know, and what they know is very limited to what history has provided for many years.
And Elizabeth, are you finding that on a national perspective as well? I know that you're in touch, and part of what your organization does is really connect with public employees on the ground floor there. What have you been hearing from them?
Yeah, so right now we're very active in Pennsylvania, New York, and then we also work with people all around the Northeast. So I guess one thing I would want our viewers to take away from that is we've got governors like next door, Governor Cuomo, actively trying to deny people their Janus rights. And he gave a very colorful Labor Day speech in which he said his administration was working to protect workers like Greg from Janus. So basically saying, I want to deny your First Amendment rights. So that's the first thing, just to know that we have powers in play, especially at the governor's level, that are actively trying to deny workers like Greg's rights. The second thing is, if you are a union member out there, or you are related to someone who is unionized and you work in the public sector, reach out to us or the Fairness Center. We can talk anytime. We don't have to worry about a window. It's your right to resign from the union anytime. Just call me. Come to my website, americansforfairtreatment.org. I think that's one thing. What we find in surveys, we do a lot of surveys. We try to have a posture of learning at all times, trying to learn from our public servants across the Northeast. And one thing we find over and over and over again is workers don't know that they can leave. They don't have to pay union dues. So that's one thing that we see across the country, especially out west. But I would say, in the Northeast, this is really pervasive. And then the other thing is, just to realize, for people to realize, this is such a hard decision. And so I applaud, again, you making that decision. What we hear all the time, so right now we're working with a lot of folks in New York City, and they've reached out, they write their opt-out letters, and then a few weeks later they ask us to cancel it because they are singled out, maybe their name is put in a newsletter or on a bulletin board. Just again, these workers are not alone. I think for a lot of people, they feel very alone, but there are thousands of people right now who are reaching out to different organizations trying to learn about leaving. So I think from my point of view, I'm not in the classroom, or I don't have a state job anymore like I did in the past, but there are lots and lots of people who are not happy with their union membership and want to change.
Kind of going to your notice point, Representative Rowe, I was perusing the bill that you've introduced, and it actually has a fairly specific notice requirement in it, and I was fairly impressed with it and excited about it, because often I've represented clients where they've not known their rights, and the union has said, no, it's on page 27, it's the light gray font and 8-point, how did they not see that, right? And it's kind of ridiculous in that sense, and who's actually going to read that? They can't even read it. And so I was really impressed with your notice requirement in the bill. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because that gets right to Elizabeth's point of notice and people knowing what their rights are.
Well, certainly. Well, it also sort of sheds a light on what they're trying to hide from their employees, isn't it? Where they do put in fine print or in very light colored font, hidden on the back page, the affirmation of rights. So my bill would require essentially that opt-out, where a person says, I'm acknowledging that my First Amendment rights say I don't have to join a union, and that has been affirmed by the United States Supreme Court, but I'm choosing to waive that to join the union. Which, if a person wants to join a union, that of course should be their decision. There's nothing wrong with that. But it shouldn't be possible for the union to create this false sense, which they do, that being a union member is a requirement to be able to have a job. And that is absolutely not the case, but they will try very desperately to make that seem like the case in order to maintain their monopoly. And monopolies, whether in the public or private sector, are very bad for the consumer, or in the case of unions, for the members. Because when there's no competition, that's when we don't have improvement, that's when we don't have progress. So we thought it was very important when we were drafting the legislation to make sure that it was in matching colored print, equal to the largest size font found within the document, that you would have that declaration of waiving of those First Amendment rights to join the union.
I think it even says in bold,
yes,
if I recall.
That is correct.
So that's fantastic. Have you gotten any pushback about the notice? It's hard for me to imagine what a straight-faced argument against that type of notice. Why wouldn't you want people to know about their constitutional rights? And I guess any of you could address this if you've heard any pushback, what reason are they giving that someone shouldn't get that type of notice?
Well, I'll start off personally, and I'll turn it over to the perspective of the boots on the ground. Personally, I have not received any pushback myself. I haven't had any, lobbyists calling me or beating down my door. But I think they also realize that they perhaps don't need to come after me. They, are perhaps going to go after members of the House who might be a little bit more vulnerable or perhaps more able to be intimidated, and they'll simply go after them and try to erode support. Because what we find fascinating, as I said earlier, is essentially these are housekeeping bills to codify in statute existing law. However, there seems to be, just from my conversations with staff on the Labor and Industry Committee, there seems to be a lack of support for putting it into statute. And when I ask, what is that opposition based in, there is no logical opposition, because like you said, it sounds absurd to say, well, we oppose this bill because we don't support the First Amendment and we're ignoring the Supreme Court. That's not a valid argument, but there isn't really a valid argument. One of the things that my bill prohibits is from the unions requiring an in-person sit down to essentially have the opportunity to then intimidate someone into joining the union. So being able to exercise your First Amendment right is something that is pivotal and essential for all Americans and for our nation as a whole. So for a monopoly of unions to try to suppress that, I think just sheds a light on how desperate they are to protect their monopoly. I'll defer to you on sort of what the national messaging opposition is.
I think what we're seeing unions say, and it is valid, is that they represent these workers. They go into, bargaining season and renegotiate the collective bargaining agreement that oversees these jobs. So that's the wages, the benefits, overtime, discipline matters. So the union is saying, we're doing this work, we should be compensated for it. And there's no argument. They are doing that work. But I think the issue here arises in that these unions are political organizations. And right now it is political season. And there are websites online like Open Secrets where you can trace the money directly from, say, the firefighters union directly to the Biden campaign. There are workers out there who do not agree with that. They don't want their membership dues or any money going from their paycheck to a political campaign that they don't agree with.
In fact, I think there was a major petition taken by the firefighters when the IAFF came out and supported Biden. A lot of firefighters started signing petitions saying, hey, you didn't consult us. Why are you doing this?
But on top of that, and this is an issue here in Pennsylvania, you've got, it's not just money, it's time and building material or overhead. So unions, there's the ghost teacher issue, which the Fairness Center is very close to. So you have full-time employees, say a teacher, instead of teaching in the classroom, they will spend 100% of their time working for the union, sometimes campaigning for the union. The union is not writing their paycheck, it's coming out of the school district's budget. And then on top of that, the number I have is a couple years old, but the Department of Education leases space to the NEA, which is the nation's largest union, to the tune of $3 million a month. So the NEA is getting free space in a federal building. So I think that's the issue where the union is becoming political. They're backing certain candidates over another. And so I think that's the thing to remember. Like, the union is a business. They are representing workers. Again, like any business, they need a revenue stream. I think the issue is that they've become political. This is not an association like KETA, which you mentioned, which is not a political association. It's just an independent association that represents workers, whether it's insurance, liability insurance, or grievance representation. So I think that's the sticking point. But I do hear from a lot of people that the union deserves to be paid and for that work. And so I think the issue there is the political issue is what makes it a problem.
Yeah, I think what I've heard from all of you is it's really the compulsion element of it, right? No one's saying that you can't join a union. In fact, if you think that's best for you, feel free, go ahead and do that. But you should also have the right, if you don't feel that's best for you, to resign and to get out of it and direct your money how you want it to be spent. And that compelling portion of it is really, I think, what's often offensive, what your legislation is trying to address, what you found yourself, and what you're seeing nationally across the board. So, well, thank you guys so much for being on this panel. It's been very informative. We appreciate it a lot.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Nathan.